session is about trauma and diabetes, which are two huge, very broad topics. And so if you leave tonight feeling, or wherever you are, whatever time it is for you in the world, if you leave feeling like, wow, like there's a lot you need to know, or there's a lot of questions you have, like that's totally expected. We're not going to cover it all in this intro workshop. And so a brief outline, we'll go through some introductions. Some of you already know each other, which is helpful. I'll guide us through a grounding practice and then move through sorry, okay, I just had to check something on the sound. I was getting a little bit of feedback. We'll move through some topics about trauma, post-traumatic stress, kind of defining those, understanding what they are, and then learning a little bit about the intersection with diabetes. I'll end talking about post-traumatic growth, and then have another mindfulness practice to kind of close our session together. And then whatever time remains, we'll be able to chat and check in. So you're welcome to introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like. Feel free to share where you're Zooming from, where you're located in the world, your connection to the diabetes community, whether you yourself have diabetes or you support someone in your life with diabetes, maybe your connection to the Sangha, maybe how you've kind of come to be in the Sangha. Seems like some of you already kind of know each other, which is great. And anything else you really want to share. So just trying to have some more of that community aspect in this virtual setting. And so while you are sharing into the chat, I'll do my very brief introduction. So I was diagnosed with type 1 in July 2001. So we're coming up in a couple weeks here, will be my diaversary. This is a picture of me. I think this is like the only picture I know of my diagnosis time. So that's little me. And I was born and raised in Northwest Ohio, spent my entire life into my early 20s in Ohio, did my undergraduate at BGSU, that's Bowling Green State University, where I studied English and psychology, and then moved to northern Minnesota for 2 years, where I started to study psychological science for my master's with a specialization in clinical counseling, and I also started to do some research on mind-body interventions for trauma care around that time. I'm currently located and Zooming to you from Greenville, North Carolina, where I'm studying clinical health psychology for my PhD. And around the same time that I was starting or kind of learning in my academic trajectory for college and undergrad, I started to learn a little bit more about mindfulness and yoga from some opportunities available on college campuses that I was involved with. And I thought, this is really interesting. I'd like to learn more about this. And so started to pursue my own certifications in general yoga teacher training, and then also trauma-sensitive yoga teacher training, and some additional training as a mindfulness facilitator. And I share that because I come to this knowing or understanding of mind-body practices from kind of 3 domains. So those 3 domains would be my personal practice, kind of how mindfulness and yoga impact me and my life, my own challenges, or in ways that it keeps me grounded. Also from the facilitator perspective, so I regularly am guiding mindfulness and yoga classes, and that's something that I really enjoy and love, working with individuals in that context. And then that third area or domain is from like an academic perspective, and so this I have studied and am continuing to study and learn about the science behind mindfulness and yoga, which is really interesting to kind of have some intersectionality between those 3 domains. And then those places, all those kind of different ways of knowing and continuing to know and continuing to grow and learn, kind of motivated me to write and publish my first book earlier this year, Mindfulness for Type 1 Diabetes. There's a picture of it here on the side in the slide. I was really looking for this in my own life, like a resource, and didn't really find any written resources that kind of tied everything together. So I decided to make one. So if you're interested, I'm always happy to talk more about the book. I do want to give a shout out here. So this, I self-published through Amazon, but then Dr. Mark Heyman, he is a clinical psychologist and also has type 1 diabetes, graciously agreed to write the foreword to the book. So recommend checking out his work if you're interested in kind of the mental health aspects of diabetes. And then this beautiful, amazing diabetes-themed mandala was created by Veronica Burkhardt, who is a diabetes advocate and also lives with type 1 in Belgium. And like the more I look at this, the more you can see the intricate detail. We've got like the insulin vials, the pens, the pumps with tubes, without. Of course, the juice boxes, some test strips. So everything's kind of in there. So that's really a unique aspect and something I always am so excited to share with people. All right. Oh, you know what? I did this earlier when I was kind of running through this. I forgot. How can I forget this? This is Leo, my 1-year-old cockapoo puppy. So yeah, I of course had to throw him in here because he is so cute and cuddly and looks so calm in this photo, but then has a burst of energy and is developing. Yeah, he's got a little bit of an attitude nowadays. So he's entering that like teenage phase. So that's Leo. He's my dog. All right, and so we'll start now with a little bit of a transition into a grounding practice. I'll guide maybe about a 5-minute practice here. So if it's helpful for you, you can decide if you'd like to stay oriented towards your screen, you're welcome to. You can also maybe shift or orient away from your screen elsewhere. And then checking in with what parts of your body are supported beneath you. So maybe checking in with how you're sitting or standing in your space. If it's helpful, you might kind of wiggle your toes or press your heels into the floor, maybe checking in with what textures you're noticing here. And after you've chosen a place for your physical body to be, you're welcome to find a place in which your eyes can rest. So maybe that means focusing on colors or objects in the space around you. Maybe you look around, kind of finding a focal point for your eyes. If it feels okay, you might start to lower your gaze or maybe close your eyes all the way. Knowing that wherever you start, you never have to stay. And that goes for how your body is resting or your eyes are resting in the space. And if you like, you might shift your attention again into noticing where your feet are connecting to the floor. Maybe you notice different textures here or different temperatures. Then shifting your awareness into your hands, perhaps noticing where your hands are resting in the space. Maybe noticing textures or temperatures here. And you're welcome to keep your awareness outside of you, noticing your feet or your hands. If you're interested, you might shift your awareness inward. Maybe here noticing how your breath is moving in your body. So without changing your breathing, starting to become curious about how your breath is already moving inside of you. Sometimes it can be helpful to place a hand over your heart or a hand over your belly or to the sides of your torso to help connect with the felt sense of the motion of your breath. So as possible, you might be noticing a rise or an expansion as you inhale, maybe a release as you exhale. You also might become curious about what the air feels like as you inhale, either through your nose or your mouth, and as you exhale, either through your nose or your mouth. And you are welcome to stay here following the rhythm of your natural breathing rate. Or kind of the last possible place that I'll offer for grounding could be syncing the motion of your breath with motion in your body. And so if that feels interesting to you, maybe you shift attention into your hands. And on your next inhale, you might open your hands, maybe you extend your fingers out. And then when you are ready to exhale, maybe you curl your fingers back in, closing your hands. So the invitation here to possibly sync your breathing with movement in your hands could be inhaling as you open your hands and exhaling as you close your hands or curl your fingers in. If you are choosing to invite movement into your hands, you might be curious about what that feels like. Maybe any sensations in your hands. Or being curious about what it's like to find a rhythm or a pace that feels okay for both breathing and moving. And you are welcome to complete one more breath cycle. That's one more inhale, followed by one more exhale at your own pace. And then when you're ready, shifting attention back into your feet. Maybe inviting movement here, kind of pressing your heels into the floor. And when you're feeling ready, starting to look around your space, maybe opening your eyes if they had been closed, kind of looking around you, noticing colors or objects nearby. When you're feeling ready, starting to reorient back to your screen, back to our virtual workshop space. Okay, so thanks for engaging or listening into that practice. And I'll start to transition now to the content for the workshop. But just want to remind you that I will be sharing about trauma tonight, which is a really important topic and can also be somewhat challenging to talk about or think about sometimes. So I really want to empower you and encourage you to kind of check in with yourself throughout. And if it would ever be useful to maybe take a break or kind of mute the workshop, you're welcome to. If you're watching this later, you can always pause and return to it. And you're also always welcome to kind of come back to these grounding possibilities if that's useful for you. So I offer kind of three different versions. One could be looking around your space, maybe noticing objects or colors nearby. You can also press or check in with your feet and kind of bring movement to your feet by pressing them into the floor, noticing textures there. And the last one was checking in with your breathing, maybe noticing how you're breathing at a natural pace. And if you wanted to, maybe you start to sync movement with breath. So that could be kind of opening, closing your hands as you're breathing in and out. Or finding whatever else works for you tonight. And so starting with what is trauma? So this is a really popular kind of buzzword right now. There might be a lot of different ideas or conceptions about trauma. This is coming from a medical standpoint and kind of like a medical definition or what is used in the mental health field to kind of define or conceptualize trauma, but knowing that there can also be other ways to think about it. And so trauma in that sense would be an event or a set of circumstances in which an individual either perceives their sense of safety has been taken away or there is a threat to their life. And there are lots of different ways in which someone might feel threatened or might be experiencing kind of a perceived threat to their life. So this list is not comprehensive, so I really want to be careful about that. But these are some of the more common maybe experiences or instances in which trauma might be defined or conceptualized. And so we can think about things like a natural disaster happening, maybe a fire or explosion, some sort of transportation accident, or really any accident in general. Exposure to toxic substances, maybe dangerous chemicals, chemotherapy, kind of any kind of toxins can sometimes maybe impact the body in traumatic ways. Assault, that could be physically with a weapon, sexual assault, or maybe any other type of abuse scenario. Also, exposure to a war zone, whether that's through combat or civilian life. Surviving captivity or living through life-threatening illnesses or injuries. Having some sort of exposure to severe human suffering, maybe learning about or knowing about sudden violent death that happens or serious injury, harm, or death that someone causes to somebody else. And then also thinking maybe more broadly, kind of systemic inequalities. So that might be like experiences of racism, oppression that we experience in daily life. And so knowing that those are some possible examples of trauma, there's also different types of exposure of trauma. And so we can think about how trauma impacts us directly if we ourselves live through any of these types of events or circumstances. We can also think about trauma that we witness happening to other people or learn about happening to those who are close to us. And the last category on the screen is trauma that's kind of part of your job. And so thinking about individuals who are first responders and how they're kind of first to the scene of traumatic experiences. There can also be healthcare providers, and so thinking like psychologists, mental health providers, those who are listening to the stories and the experiences of individuals who have lived through trauma, or even healthcare in the medical sense of maybe working to fix or to help someone who has been exposed to life-threatening injuries. So I know this is a lot of information, but I wanted to just kind of give a little bit of a way that we sometimes can think about trauma or give some sort of definition to that with examples. And so here on the screen is something called the biopsychosocial model, which I think is really important when we're sort of conceptualizing trauma. It's really important to remember that two people can live through the exact same experience or set of events and have very different impacts or effects from it. So I want to highlight that the effects of trauma are unique to each individual, and that'll be based because we all have different unique circumstances, we have different identities, different access to resources, and live in different parts of the world. And so all those influences together are going to make our experiences from trauma very individualized. So taking this biopsychosocial idea into practice would be thinking about how trauma can have biological, psychological, and social impacts for each of us in different ways and to different extents, and they also overlap. And so on the screen is this little like infographic or kind of design here, and it's pretty symmetrical, like the spaces, the overlap here, but know that this can also shift and change. And so this like the blue at the bottom for psychological might be pushed up a little bit more if there's more of an emphasis or more of an impact from trauma on the biological and social. So that was just one example, but knowing that these circles don't have to be kind of evenly spaced, those are also going to be individualized to each of us. And then it also acknowledges that there is sort of like a physiological, maybe predisposition or kind of impact that someone might have that could impact how they are reacting or their outcomes to trauma experiences. There's also the psychological part and then the social influences as well. And so there's not just one area that deserves more attention, but tonight you'll probably hear me talk a little bit more about the psychological piece, and then I'll bring in a little bit of the biology when we start to talk about diabetes, but know that all three of these are important and warrant further kind of conversation and thinking about. And so with that, we're going to transition to maybe more of some of the common kind of post-traumatic stress symptoms or experiences that someone might have after living through an event or set of circumstances that we had on the first couple of slides. And they're kind of broken down into these four categories that researchers and people in the mental health field or medical field will often kind of use as ways to maybe measure or see the impacts of trauma. And so the first one here is intrusions. And so that's kind of thinking about having recurrent experiences of really distressing memories of the trauma. Recurrent meaning you can't control them and they're happening when you don't want them to. This can also be related to kind of dissociation experiences or maybe experiences of flashbacks, which is when you might be thinking that the trauma is happening all over again in the present moment, when in reality it is not, but it feels that way. Other experiences that kind of fall in this category of an intrusion would be like an intense or prolonged distress when exposed to reminders of trauma, kind of like internally or externally, maybe triggered or reminded of a trauma, and having kind of high physiological reactions. So maybe like increase in heart rate and blood pressure, maybe feeling very tense and kind of on edge when exposed to those reminders. And then over here, category 2 would be avoidance. And so we can think of avoidance as avoiding internal reminders of trauma. So trying to avoid maybe feelings or thoughts or memories that are associated with the experience or set of experiences. You can also think of avoidance as in an external way. And so having a lot of effort to avoid going somewhere that reminds someone of the trauma, or engaging in activities or being around people, or even having kind of like physiological responses to certain smells or tastes or kind of anything that's external that might be a trigger or reminder of the trauma. Down here, category 3 would be a negative change in mood or cognition. And this is a really big one because mood and cognition can be kind of separate. So there are lots of different examples that fall into this category. So this might be someone has maybe difficulty or an inability to remember important parts of a traumatic experience. There might also be a change in kind of sense of self or beliefs about the world after experiencing trauma. And so someone's worldview might be shifted or changed in a persistently negative way. And so maybe thinking like, I deserved this, or I am to blame for this, or some other common examples might be like, the world is unsafe, and really holding on to those beliefs. There can also be a change in thinking patterns, and so very similar to kind of the worldview, but an overall sense of feeling a lot of self-blame for the experience or putting that blame on others. Additionally, there could be some negative emotional experiences. So this kind of feeling of persistent negative emotions like horror, guilt, anger, shame, which are all human emotions and we all experience them on a spectrum. It's feeling as if those emotions are persistently and constantly there, which then is related to another example that can fall into category 3 would be in having difficulty feeling the more positive emotions. So difficulty feeling a sense of happiness, joy, love, or satisfaction because those negative feelings are so often there. And then the last one that falls into this category would be maybe feeling like detached from oneself, a sense of detachment from self or from others. And so it may be feeling like it's harder to connect with other people and just feel enjoyment in activities that maybe someone used to do or might be expecting to feel joy from. And then the last category down here is increased reactivity or arousal. And so this is when someone might be feeling that they are more irritable or have this persistent sense of irritability, or maybe more prone to angry outbursts without having a lot of kind of triggers or being provoked into having those negative feelings. This can be kind of like verbal or physical aggression, maybe engaging in more reckless or self-destructive types of behavior. So that would be kind of like the reactivity piece. So also then another way to think about reactivity could be feeling a sense of hypervigilance. And so feeling like the individual is constantly on guard or watchful or kind of waiting for something very bad to happen again. Relatedly, having maybe difficulties kind of concentrating or being in the present moment because that sense of feeling like you need to be on guard is constantly there. Individuals might also notice maybe an exaggerated startle response, and so maybe feeling like they're kind of more jumpy or reactive to things in a larger way than maybe before they had experienced the trauma. And then the last kind of symptom or experience that falls here would be having difficulty falling or staying asleep, or kind of feeling like you're not getting full amount of sleep and it's very restless sleep overall. And so I know I just went through a lot of different types of what we call post-traumatic stress symptoms that are kind of in these 4 categories. There's about 20 that I went through, but that's just one kind of snippet. That's just one piece and one way that maybe mental health providers or medical professionals will conceptualize post-traumatic stress. I want to also acknowledge that there are other ways in which our bodies can react, our bodies and our minds can react, and that might also be causing distress in someone's daily life that I didn't mention here. This is just kind of like one snippet or one way to start to think about it. And so with that, it is expected or possible that someone who experiences trauma, so one of those events from any exposure that we talked about in the beginning slides, might then start to experience some of these post-traumatic stress symptoms that I just named or listed and talked about. Often, those post-traumatic stress symptoms will kind of run their course. They'll move through the body and the mind at their own time and dissipate after the trauma has passed. There's also the possibility that those symptoms are persistent and stay with someone and start to create more distress and make it hard to kind of get through daily life. In that case, that's when maybe you might have known of the phrase post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. That's kind of what would differentiate between someone experiencing post-traumatic stress and maybe someone having post-traumatic stress disorder. So I just want to kind of maybe clarify there, and we can talk a little bit about that in the discussion part 2 if there's any questions about that. All right, I'm gonna open all these here. Okay, and so prevalence is very difficult to, as you might be able to imagine or kind of coming up with here, how prevalent trauma is based on the definition, right? And so, yeah, there are some events that seem to be more related to post-traumatic stress symptoms, but we also want to keep that open mind of like, well, how does it impact someone, and then use reactions to trauma as maybe a way to define if something is traumatic or not. Because again, two people can live through the exact same thing, and one person could be impacted by it, one person might not be. And so estimations here, these are just estimations from the World Health Organization, thinking that about 70% of the population of the world experience at least one trauma, with on average about 3 events over a lifetime. And again, when we look at statistics, I think it's always important to remember, like, okay, who might be underreporting, who might be overreporting, right? Those are things we want to keep in mind. But overall, after looking at the list of potentially traumatic events that we opened the workshop with, 70%, it kind of makes sense, right? It's a wide range of stressful, scary, horrifying, life-threatening experiences. It makes sense that we are all possibly going to have at least one of them. And then a little bit kind of like coming in then, so trauma exposure, but then coming down to post-traumatic stress. And so those were the symptoms that I just talked about, or experiences I just talked about on the previous slide. I could not find any stats maybe about the stress in general, probably because that's really hard to document, and knowing kind of when things dissipate or when things kind of ease out on their own. But there are global PTSD rates. So there's about 4% of individuals globally across the lifespan, across the lifetime. And so that's considering children and all the way through adulthood. About 4% will have a diagnosis of PTSD at some point in the lifetime. And I thought interesting for kind of maybe this audience would be medical trauma. And so if you remember on one of the first slides, talking about the life-threatening illness or injury. And so that would be a medical trauma. About 1 in 4 people who go through a life-threatening illness or injury will develop post-traumatic stress symptoms, right? And so that's not as far as saying the post-traumatic stress disorder itself, but having any kind of combination of those symptoms of maybe feeling like your worldview has changed, or feeling like you're in a persistent negative mood, or feeling very on guard or watchful, or kind of waiting for a really scary, horrible thing to happen again in the future. So any kind of combination there. So that's 1 in 4. Okay. And so then relatedly, starting to talk about maybe the intersection with diabetes. And so we have kind of 3 different categories that get a little bit more narrow as we keep going. So the first one is thinking about trauma and physical health. So physical health broadly, there is a very strong connection that researchers have established between individuals who go through trauma early in life, childhood trauma, and then having an increased risk of developing chronic health conditions and or general physical health challenges into adulthood. So that's pretty established, and might be new information to you, or might not be, but that link is there. Kind of taking a step inward then, there's also a link established between post-traumatic stress disorder and diabetes, and the kind of 2 areas of research that I was reading a little bit about. The first one is that individuals who have a pre-existing diagnosis of PTSD, right, have PTSD, are at an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes some point down the line. So that link is there, and that's pretty strong. The other kind of area in which there's some research going on is that individuals who have diabetes of some type 1, type 2, gestational, any kind of exposure with diabetes, are at an increased risk of experiencing post-traumatic stress symptoms if they live through trauma after the diabetes diagnosis. And then that risk also increases for possibly experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. So maybe symptoms are severe and difficult enough in which maybe a diagnosis of PTSD is warranted. So those are really interesting, kind of two different ways to think about it, right? Kind of which one comes first. There's evidence for both. So then if we kind of maybe take a step in again, thinking about diabetes as the trauma, right? And so if we go back to this idea of medical trauma, life-threatening illness or injury or experience of a life-changing diagnosis can be considered traumatic to some individuals, right? And again, I want to really reiterate that point about trauma is individualized, it's unique to each of us. You always have the right to say if something was traumatic to you or not. So I'm not saying that if someone has experienced a health condition that it will be traumatic, but I'm saying there is a possibility, and research demonstrates that that link exists. And so some examples might be the diagnosis itself, right? Whatever that diagnosis story is, that could be what's causing a lot of the distress and the post-traumatic stress. Could also be experiences at some point throughout the experience of diabetes, of maybe hypoglycemia, maybe severe low blood sugar, DKA, severe high blood sugar, or any other medical complications that people with diabetes are faced with just knowing the fear of, and then also might be living at some point in their journey. And then the last section down here is kind of thinking about the effects of trauma on diabetes itself. And so this has also been established pretty clearly in the literature that trauma-induced mental health conditions, so we think PTSD, which is what I've spent a lot of time talking about, but also maybe other mental health conditions like anxiety or depression, which are also can also occur maybe after someone goes through trauma or while someone's dealing with trauma. So mental health conditions are associated with worse kind of acute and long-term glycemic outcomes. And so we know kind of like worse time in range, harder to stay time in range with blood sugars in the moment. And then we all know, or have probably been told a million times, that kind of like short-term blood sugars impact long-term blood sugars or long-term glycemic outcomes. There's also been some work done around maintenance of health behaviors. And so that refers to things like eating and counting carbs and administering insulin and taking the right dose, doing all those things that we have to do all day long, constantly. Exercise, so health behaviors broadly, but think about anything you're doing during the day that's helping you manage your condition. That's a health behavior. Health behaviors are already hard to maintain and to do, and they're even harder to maintain and keep up with when someone is experiencing mental health challenges or in the middle of traumatic experiences, kind of going through it in the moment. It's making those behaviors harder, which then we can see the cycle of how health behaviors impact our current, or those acute blood sugars, and also those long-term glycemic outcomes. Another way to think about this, kind of the effects of trauma on diabetes, would be through stress responses. And so when someone is going through traumatic stress, either in the moment or post-traumatic stress, which is kind of after the experience has ended, there is dysregulated cortisol and adrenaline, which are hormones in our body that really, really impact insulin sensitivity. And so we can think about this in like a general stress sense, but then also in the post-traumatic stress sense, which then impact glucose metabolism. The same thing with inflammatory markers. Those are kind of different ways that our body experiences inflammation when we're maybe having chronic stress or having chronic mental health challenges or difficulties. That's going to further the metabolic dysfunction. So these middle points are kind of like two ways in which maybe this top one, kind of to explain this top one right here. And so then based on this, there has been, this work is really recent, right? I would say in the last like 20 years, but then much more recently, about 4 years ago, there was finally like a call for trauma screening to happen in endocrinology offices, kind of just in primary care in general. So individuals can start to maybe get resources or seek support if they didn't know that those supports were offered to begin with. So having more awareness about trauma, its impacts, and how it might influence diabetes especially. And then also a call for trauma-informed healthcare, or that would be to provide the resources that are in a trauma-sensitive way that will maybe not re-traumatize or trigger individuals who need extra support at the time. All to say that this is to fully be able to promote holistic diabetes care. So diabetes care is more than just the biological piece and counting carbs and taking insulin. We all know that there's a lot more that goes into it, and this is kind of like the psychological and the social piece coming into. Okay. And so I spent a lot of time kind of outlining or mapping kind of the negative implications of going through trauma. And I wanted to also highlight that there is this idea of post-traumatic growth that can occur after experiencing trauma. And so post-traumatic growth is defined as the positive psychological transformation that someone might experience after going through trauma. And super, super, super important to say that this idea of post-traumatic growth or growing from a life-threatening, severe experience does not deny the severity of the trauma or circumstances. It doesn't take away how horrifying and scary and life-threatening those experiences were, or deny or diminish the impacts of post-traumatic stress, right? So those are kind of what we spend a lot of time talking about following the events. But it is to say that it is a possibility, and it's to grow or to find some maybe positive experiences after these big life events. But it should be defined by the survivor at their own time and their own pace. And so never, maybe just taking a moment to acknowledge that for yourself, maybe, or for others that you might know of, never kind of maybe setting a timeline for saying like somebody should have identified some positive aspect or some silver lining at a certain timeline, right? That doesn't exist, and that's not very helpful. And then I wanted to list some possible ways that post-traumatic growth could happen. So this is the foundational researchers who kind of come up with this idea and the term. This isn't all the ways, but these are like the main ways. And then again, this is going to be very individualized to the person as well. And so someone might experience a newfound sense of personal strength after enduring trauma or traumatic experiences. They might have found new possibilities, could also improve relationships. There's this sense of maybe spiritual growth or maybe kind of newfound spiritual awareness in life. And then overall, perhaps a general deeper appreciation for life. Okay, and then this is my last like content slide. This is kind of maybe the takeaways or things that I'm hoping to reiterate from this workshop or the start of this conversation. So the importance of being aware of trauma or having trauma awareness. It's important that we acknowledge that trauma is pervasive across the globe, right? No one is immune to experiencing trauma, and yeah, it can happen to any of us, may have happened to some of us, and that's just something to kind of remember, right? There's nothing wrong or different or bad about somebody who experiences trauma. I also hope to reiterate that it's important to recognize the holistic impacts of trauma. And so that's kind of going back to those 3 circles on the slide, where there's the psychological, biological, social impacts, and even more than that, right? On there is not spiritual impacts, or even just kind of like knowing yourself as who you are and what your role is in the world. So knowing that that will be individual for each person, and that's kind of an ever-growing maybe self-exploration for individuals. I also hope to reduce stigma that's associated with mental health. And so knowing that if someone does experience trauma and they are maybe experiencing distress or those kind of like post-traumatic stress symptoms afterwards, it's okay to seek help and to reach out and to get the support that will help you in the moment, ultimately, because that'll help you maybe develop or kind of have that sense for post-traumatic growth overall. So that kind of ties into this point here. Yeah, please seek support as needed. I'll have some resources at the end of the workshop too to share. And then thinking about going through your daily life and how we interact with people. I think this is really important. I always like to keep this in mind too, of like, we never know what someone's going through or what they've been through. And so just kind of keeping that sense of empathy, kindness, and compassion. So that way in our personal interactions, and then even in maybe more formal spaces like this one or with the Sangha, we can start to create those healing interactions and places for individuals to feel safe and to feel respected as well. Right. So I know that was a ton of content and a lot of perhaps maybe heavy content as well. So I will guide about a 5-minute closing mindfulness practice, and then we'll transition to community discussion. And so, if you like, you might decide how you want to orient for your practice. And so, maybe that means staying oriented towards your screen. It could also mean maybe looking around your space or kind of turning away from your screen. You might look around and find a place in which you can focus your eyes, maybe noticing colors or objects nearby. If it feels okay, you might start to lower your gaze out towards the tip of your nose, or maybe close your eyes all the way. And taking a moment to check in with your body right here, right now. Maybe starting at your feet and practicing noticing how your feet feel, maybe what they're resting on, and continuing that awareness up into your legs. When you're ready, you might check in with your hips, or how you're sitting or standing in your space. Noting and describing kind of whatever your awareness is being pulled towards in your body scan. And if you like, you could shift your attention into your torso, maybe noticing if your torso is upright in space or if it's resting against something for support. And shift into your shoulders, noticing whatever's present here. Maybe shifting into your arms, checking in with your hands. And lastly, shifting awareness into your face, your head. And then acknowledging yourself as a whole. Your whole body is resting here in this space. If there's any movement your body might be calling for, maybe you start to invite that movement into your body. Maybe that means wiggling your fingers or wiggling your toes. Or maybe that means larger movements like opening your arms or sending your arms out to your sides, or maybe reaching your arm up overhead. There's also a possibility that your body's asking for stillness here. So kind of using this time to be curious and see what your body's calling for and seeing if you can kind of be there with it. Stillness or movement. One more possibility I'll offer here could be checking in with how you're breathing. So maybe you notice if your breath is inhaling, if you're inhaling or exhaling through your nose or your mouth. If you like, maybe you choose to place a hand over your heart or a hand over your belly. Kind of follow that rhythm of your inhale and your exhale. If you are noticing your breath, you might be curious about the temperature of the air. What does it feel like as you inhale and as you exhale? You're welcome to complete one more breath cycle. It's one more inhale, followed by one more exhale. Checking back in with your body if you had been moving. Maybe you start to close or end those movements. In your own way, you're welcome to reorient back to your screen, back to our virtual workshop. All right. Thanks for engaging in that practice in whatever way felt useful for you. I do want to share kind of three more really brief slides, and then we'll end the slideshow and come back together as a group for questions, comments, discussion, whatever feels supportive in the space. And so I have a list of resources here, and you can either take a picture of this, screenshot it, or when I leave the PowerPoint, I have a link to a Google Doc that has everything here listed that I will put in the chat. So you can also download that. So whatever you want, but I wanted to just kind of describe it briefly. So this first slide is for resources. This is related to kind of trauma, mental health broadly. The first two are for free, 24/7, confidential text support lines for you or for someone you might know. And then the last four are for further information about trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, mental health generally. I do want to acknowledge that I don't have any affiliations with any of these resources. I do think it's always important to kind of give and offer resources, and these are some credible sources that I found throughout my time, so I wanted to share them here for you if you'd like. The second slide is my contact information, and so you're welcome to connect with me in any of these ways. I have a website, MBP with KMD, that's Mind Body Practices with Kelsey, Madison, Dietrich, and so that's where you can learn a little bit more about my background, my interest in trauma-sensitive yoga and mindfulness, and additional info about the book. I also have some social media pages. There's a Facebook page, Mindfulness for Type 1 Diabetes, and also an Instagram page. And I do also have an email, so if you want to stay in conversation about any of these topics or have ideas for other ways in which we can kind of bring mindfulness to the type 1 diabetes community or kind of more conversations about trauma, I'm always happy to connect with individuals. And then the last slide, references. I told you I come from an academic perspective, and so I think it's important to kind of cite who I was referring to and how the content that made up the PowerPoint. So these are here, but also I think it's kind of cool because if any of these, any points I talked about tonight are interesting to you that you'd actually want to read further information about, then that's how you can find the source in which it came from. So again, I'll put a link to all this in the chat in just a minute. So I just want to thank you so much for joining today. It was wonderful to have your attention, and yeah, hopefully we'll have some good conversation in a minute. I do also want to announce that this was set up to be a two-part workshop. And so this first one was really foundational, kind of like starting to think about or be curious about what is trauma, how can trauma impact individuals. And then the second part of the workshop will be an introduction to trauma-sensitive mindfulness. That's happening 3 weeks from today, same time, same link, where I'll go more in depth of like, okay, now that we know what trauma is, then how can we make mindfulness and meditation practices perhaps more accessible for ourselves or for others when struggling or managing trauma experiences? All right. Okay, so I'm going to get that link that I promised you all. And yes, I'm also going to stop recording so we can transition to our group discussion here.